The Warmth He Left Behind, Part 1, won a grave with a deed, Coldwater Gulch, Montana Territory, October 1887. The mountains did not care about the town beneath them. They never had. They stood as they had always stood, vast and indifferent, their highest ridges already draped in the first white of the season. From a distance, Coldwater Gulch looked like a man's ambition scratched into the base of something ancient and immovable. A cluster of raw timber buildings, a church steeple that had not yet been painted, a main street of packed mud that turned to frozen iron each night and soft treachery each afternoon. It was a town in the process of becoming, and like all such towns, it had already decided without ever saying so plainly who belonged to it and who did not. The morning air carried the smell of pine smoke and cold iron. It carried the sound of hammers from the new assay office going up on the north end of Main Street. It carried, if you listened carefully, the dry and persistent cough of a woman who had been losing ground to the Montana winters for 2 years running. Ruth Stone sat on the single wooden step outside the town hall, her shawl pulled tight across her chest, her breath making small ghosts in the morning air. She was 42 years old, but looked older the way hard country ages a person faster than time alone can manage. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and clear, and in them lived a particular kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of a woman who had buried her husband, spent her savings, watched her daughter grow quiet and watchful as a hawk, and now sat waiting to learn how little the world intended to leave her with. Beside her, Eliza Stone stood, not sat, stood. She was 17 years old and she had her father's build, lean and economical, nothing wasted. She had his stillness too. The kind of stillness that is not passivity, but something closer to its opposite. A coiled, deliberate attention. She wore a coat that had been her father's, the sleeves taken up 2 inches by her mother's careful stitching, the collar turned against the wind. Her dark hair was pulled back plainly, her hands already roughened far beyond what a girl her age should know, were clasped in front of her with a patience that made her look in that morning light like someone considerably older than 17. She was waiting. She had been waiting her whole life, it seemed, for the particular thing that was about to happen. She did not know that, but some part of her had been preparing for it anyway. The door to the town hall opened, and a man appeared in the frame. Virgil Cutter was 55 years old and had the appearance of a man who had decided somewhere in his early 30s that prosperity was the only virtue worth cultivating. He was broad through the shoulders and narrow through the eyes, and he wore his wealth the way some men wear religion, as a constant reminder to others of where they stood by comparison. He had come to Coldwater Gulch 15 years ago with 2 mules and a letter of credit and had turned both into something considerable. He owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, a controlling interest in the copper mine, and 4 of the 7 buildings on Main Street. He also served by the unanimous consent of the 5-man town council, which he had largely appointed himself as chairman of that body. He had kind words for no one this morning. The business of the meeting had already been conducted inside among the 5 men in the way that real decisions are always made before the parties most affected are asked to appear. What remained was only the formality of delivery. He looked at Ruth Stone and then at her daughter, and his expression held the particular combination of pity and satisfaction that belongs to men who have confused efficiency with righteousness. "The council has reviewed your situation," he said. His voice was the voice of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "Given the outstanding rent on the cabin, given the approaching winter, given the needs of the new assayer who requires proper lodging." He paused as if giving these points time to settle. "The cabin on charter land cannot remain in your occupation." Ruth said nothing. She had expected this. Knowing a blow is coming does not make it land more softly, but it does allow a person to remain standing afterward. Eliza said nothing either. She watched Cutter's face. However, Cutter continued reaching inside his coat for a folded document. The council is not without charity. He held out the paper the way a man holds out something he wants to appear generous in surrendering. We have deeded you 3 acres at the eastern boundary. The land is yours free and clear to do with as you see fit. Ruth took the deed with both hands. She unfolded it. She read it or tried to. Her eyes moved across the words, but understanding came slowly the way it does when you are hearing something your mind resists accepting. Eliza did not reach for the paper. She was still watching Cutter. She knew the land. Everyone in Coldwater Gulch knew the land at the eastern boundary. They called it the Devil's Yawn, and they called it that because the only notable feature of the place was a dark opening in a north-facing wall of rock, a fissure perhaps 10 feet across and 7 feet high, and behind it a cave that the children dared each other to enter, and that the adults universally agreed was good for nothing at all. The slope above it was scree and stubborn juniper. There was no timber worth cutting, no soil worth tilling, no water except the violent spring runoff that tore down the hillside each March and went to waste in the gully below. The nearest cabin was 2 miles distant. It was not a gift. Everyone present knew it was not a gift. It was a removal. It was the town's way of washing its hands. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word. It came from somewhere low in her chest, caught, and then subsided into the cough that had become the constant companion of her days. Eliza reached out then and took the deed from her mother's hands. She read it. Her eyes moved deliberately across each line with the kind of attention that her father had taught her to give to any document, any map, any page of figures. She read the legal description of the land. She read the boundary notations. She read the standard clauses of property transfer. And then she read near the bottom, in the dense language of territorial law, a clause that Virgil Cutter had signed without pausing on because the land was worthless, and he knew it was worthless, and no man pauses carefully over the details of something he believes to have no value. The clause pertained to mineral rights. Eliza folded the deed. She folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it inside her father's coat. "We thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. She offered Cutter nothing further. No gratitude beyond those 3 words. No distress for him to measure himself against. No performance of defeat. She put her arm around her mother's shoulders, and they walked down the step, together out into the cold morning, away from the town hall, and the man who stood in its doorway watching them go, with an expression that had shifted almost imperceptibly from satisfaction into something less comfortable. Eliza did not look back. The walk back to the cabin took 12 minutes. They did not speak during it. What was there to say that the silence did not already hold? Ruth's cough came and went, the irregular percussion of a body fighting a battle on its own terms and losing ground slowly. Eliza walked with her hand at her mother's elbow, steadying without fussing, present without crowding. Inside the cabin she made tea. She stoked the small iron stove. She sat across from her mother at the table they had shared through 2 Montana winters and one long grief, and she watched the steam rise from the cups. Ruth said, "I don't know how we'll manage it." Eliza said, "We will figure it out." It was not dismissal. It was not false comfort. It was simply the truth as Eliza understood it, stated plainly without decoration. That night after her mother slept, Eliza sat at the table alone with a single tallow candle and the small wooden box that had come home from the mine with her father's other things. The box contained, in addition to a few rock samples wrapped in cloth and a compass with a cracked lens, a journal. The journal was not large. It was the size of a man's hand, bound in dark leather that had been rubbed nearly black by years of handling, in places where a man's hands were never entirely clean. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, angular and precise, the script of a man who had taught himself to write as an adult, and who had approached the task with the same methodical care he applied to everything. The entries mixed English and the occasional Welsh phrase that Eliza had long since memorized without fully understanding, and they moved between the practical and the philosophical in the way that journals do when a man is spending his days underground with no one to talk to and a great deal to think about. Owen Stone had been a miner, not by birth but by inclination. He had grown up in the valleys of South Wales, the son of a collier, and he had gone underground at 13 like every other boy around him, and unlike most of them, he had not merely endured it. He had loved it. Not the labor which was brutal, nor the danger which was constant, but the deep, slow geological truth of it. The underground world operated on timescales that made human ambition look like the flicker of a struck match. The rock remembered things that no living creature could. It held temperatures that the surface with its wild swings of season could never sustain. It was honest in a way the surface world rarely was. He had come to Montana in 1879, following the copper boom, and he had spent 8 years reading the mountain the way other men read newspapers. He had not found wealth. He had found instead a woman from a small Polish city who was also far from home and who looked at him with a directness he found unsettling and then irresistible. He had found a daughter who inherited his stillness and her mother's clarity of gaze. He had found in the last 2 years before the shaft collapse that killed him a kind of contentment that the journal recorded in plain, unhurried sentences. He had not lived to 40. But he had left behind in that small, dark leather book more practical wisdom than most men accumulate in twice that span. Eliza turned the pages slowly. She was looking for something, though she could not have said precisely what. Something her father had said once or written once about cold and heat and the behavior of stone. A conversation half remembered from when she was 12 or 13, sitting beside him while he drew his careful diagrams by firelight. She found it not in the middle of the journal, but near the end, in an entry dated to the autumn of 1883, 4 years before he died. The page was marked. She had not marked it. A length of red thread had been wound twice around the book at that page, not a casual thing, not something that happened by accident. He had marked it. He had marked it and left it there in the box with his rock samples and his cracked compass. And in 4 years of occasional browsing through those pages, she had never quite arrived at this one. The entry began with a survey notation, a series of coordinates that meant nothing to her, followed by a brief geological description in her father's abbreviated shorthand. Precambrian granite north-facing slope depth of formation, estimated at considerable age by rock type and layering. What followed was unusual. Where most entries maintained their professional detachment, this one shifted register, became in places almost urgent. He had found the cave, the exact cave, the same north-facing fissure in the same wall of ancient rock that Virgil Cutter had signed over to her that morning as though he were doing the stones a favor. Owen had gone into it while prospecting the eastern claims 4 years before his daughter stood in the cold outside a town hall holding a deed to what the world considered worthless ground. He had sat in it apparently for some time. He wrote about the stillness inside, about the way the temperature changed the moment you crossed the threshold, leaving the surface world behind. He wrote in the angular shorthand she knew so well about the geology of the interior, about the granite's thermal properties, about the angle of the slope outside and what it implied for airflow. And then he had done something that Eliza read twice to be certain she had understood. He had drawn a diagram. It was small, no more than a few square inches of the journal page, but it was precise and unmistakably intentional. A horizontal passage cross-section, a firebox at one end, a long, gently sloping channel running beneath a floor lined with stone, terminating in a vertical stack at a distance. Beside the channel, he had written figures for thermal conduction. Beside the stack, he had written notes on draw and draft differential. And at the bottom of the diagram, in letters slightly larger than his usual script, he had written words that Eliza read and then sat with in the candlelit silence of the cabin for a long time. The stone is a miser. Teach the smoke to work for its passage, and the mountain will become the furnace. This place could hold a family through any winter this territory can produce. God willing, no one who matters to me will ever need to know that. The candle had burned low by the time Eliza set the journal down. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the cabin walls with a low, searching sound. Her mother was sleeping in the next room, her breathing audible through the thin partition, rising and catching slightly, on each exhale in the way that had become familiar and frightening both. Eliza looked at the deed which she had placed on the table beside the journal. She looked at her father's diagram. She looked at the folded document with its dense legal language and its overlooked clause. She was 17 years old, and the world had just handed her what it intended as a death sentence, written on paper delivered with a show of charity. She understood, sitting there in the candlelight, that it was something else entirely. She did not sleep much that night. The next morning was sharp and clear. The sky the hard blue that comes before serious cold, the frost on the grass catching the early sun and burning it white. Eliza walked the 2 miles to the eastern boundary alone. Her mother was resting. There were things Ruth could do and things she could not, and a 2-mile walk up a scree slope was currently among the latter. The path wound away from the settled part of the gulch quickly. Within half a mile, the sounds of the town fell away, and the only sounds were the wind in the juniper and the intermittent complaint of a hawk working the thermals above the ridge. The ground rose steadily. The rock became more prominent underfoot slabs and loose shale alternating with patches of hard-packed earth that took the frost on their surface and held it. She found the cave. It was worse than she remembered from the one time she had seen it 2 summers ago, when a group of the town's children had walked out here on a dare, and she had come along without quite knowing why. At that age it had seemed merely dark and cold, and faintly threatening. Now she measured it differently. She stood in front of the fissure and took it apart with her father's eyes. The entrance faced north. That was important. A north-facing opening received no direct sunlight and would remain cold on the surface, but it also meant no thermal shock, no dramatic cycling between hot and cold that would stress the stone. The wall it was cut into was, as her father had written, Precambrian granite, some of the oldest and most thermally stable rock on the continent. The slope above ran steeply upward for 200 yards before leveling at the ridge, and the prevailing wind came from the northwest, which meant the entrance was partially sheltered by the rock shoulder above and to the left. She pushed aside the brambles and stepped through. Inside, the air changed immediately. The wind cut out. The temperature dropped several degrees, but in a different way than outside, not the dry, moving cold of the surface, but something stiller and more fundamental. The smell was of wet stone and deep earth and time. The light from the entrance fell away within 15 feet, and beyond that was darkness of a kind that has its own texture. She stood in the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The cave extended perhaps 30 feet before narrowing into a crack too tight to enter. The floor was uneven, a mix of dirt and fallen stone. The ceiling rose to roughly 10 feet at its highest point, then sloped down toward the back. The walls sweated faintly, the granite weeping thin threads of mineral water that had found their way through cracks over centuries. It was cold. It was dark. It smelled of the deep earth. Anyone else would have turned around. Eliza sat down on a flat rock near the entrance and closed her eyes. She did what her father had taught her to do in any space below the surface. She listened. Not for sounds, though there were sounds, the minute creak and settle of stone, the faint whisper of air moving through unseen fissures, the distant drip of water. She listened past the sounds. She listened for the quality of the silence underneath them, the character of the space, the way the mountain breathed. Her father used to say that every underground space had a personality, not in any mystical sense. He was not a mystical man. He meant it in the practical way that any experienced miner means that a space's geometry, its orientation, its rock type, its hydrology, all of these create conditions that a trained person can read the way a sailor reads wind. You had to be quiet enough to hear what the space was telling you. Most people were never quiet enough. Eliza sat and listened for a long time. When she finally rose and walked back out into the hard autumn light, she had not made a decision. A decision implies choice, and she had understood by then that there was no choice, not really. There was only the thing to be done and the question of whether she could do it. She stood on the scree slope outside the cave, and looked back down the 2 miles of path toward Coldwater Gulch. The town sat there in its small, human way, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the hammer blows of the new assay office carrying thinly on the wind. She thought about her father's diagram, the long flue channel beneath the floor, the thermal mass of the stone, the smoke forced to surrender its heat on a 40-foot journey before emerging cool and thin from a distant stack. She thought about the miser in the stone, Shwati. She turned back to the cave. There was a great deal of work to be done. The work began 2 days later. Ruth insisted. Eliza had planned to let her mother rest and do the preliminary clearing alone, but Ruth appeared at the cave mouth on the second morning with a shawl over her coat and a determination in her face that Eliza recognized as the particular kind that cannot be argued with. They worked side by side. They cleared loose rock from the floor of the cave, carrying each stone out by hand, creating a level surface over the course of 3 brutal days. Their fingers split. Their back ached in ways that kept them both awake at night. They heated water for their hands each evening and said little about the pain because saying it would not have helped. On the third day, Eliza began to dig. She had her father's pickaxe, which was heavier than was comfortable, and which she had learned to use over the course of her childhood by watching him and then by practicing alone in the hours when he was underground, and she was supposed to be doing other things. The ground inside the cave was compacted earth over shattered rock, and it did not yield without a fight. Every inch of the trench was a negotiation between the steel head of the pick and the stubborn memory of the earth. She planned the trench carefully, laying it out with a length of rope and 4 stakes before she struck the first blow. It would run 40 feet beginning at the point inside the cave where the firebox would be built, and extending outward, angling beneath the cave floor, and then continuing underground beyond the entrance, terminating at a point sufficiently removed that the chimney stack would draw effectively without creating a backdraft. The channel would be narrow, just wide enough to allow the hot gases to travel in direct contact with the stone lining she would set into the walls of the trench. The stones for that lining she was already collecting from the scree slope above, selecting flat pieces of the granite that was everywhere underfoot. She worked from first light until the light failed. Ruth came and went mixing the clay she dug from the creek bank a quarter-mile away, preparing the mortar that would seal the stones of the flue into a continuous thermal surface. It was slow work. It was precise work. It was the kind of work that demanded attention at every point and forgave nothing. On the 6th day of this work, they had company. Aldous Mercer came up the slope on a gray horse, riding with the easy authority of a man who was used to being the most capable person in any situation involving timber and tools. He was in his mid-40s, broad and deliberate in his movements, with hands that were permanently stained with pine resin and a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent, slight frown that was not displeasure exactly, but the expression of a man who has been solving structural problems for so long that he looks at everything as a potential problem to be solved. He had built nearly every cabin in Coldwater Gulch. He had raised the frame of the church and the town hall and the new assay office. He was by any reasonable measure the most technically accomplished man in the valley, and he knew it, and he was not ungenerous with his knowledge. But there was a confidence in him that had over the years hardened into something close to certainty, and certainty in any craftsman is the beginning of the end of learning. He stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at what Eliza was doing for a long time before he said anything. She kept working. She was laying the last of the capstones on the section of flue nearest the firebox, bedding each one in clay mortar, checking each joint with her fingers. He said her name. She looked up, shielding her eyes with the back of her hand. "I've come to see how you're getting on," he said in a tone that had kindness in it, and also the faint condescension of a man who already knows the answer. He studied the trench, the lined channel, the growing pile of excavated earth beside the cave mouth. He studied the structure of the entrance where she had begun to frame the wall that would seal the cave against the outside air. What he saw confused him. It did not look like anything he recognized as shelter building. It looked like a girl digging an elaborate ditch and lining it with rocks for reasons he could not fathom. He had, however, come with a genuine offer. There was lumber at his mill, he said. Not much, but enough for a small lean-to against the south face of that rock wall. A proper fireplace, a low roof adequate to keep them alive through the winter. It would be tight and it would require constant wood, but it was survivable. He had built shelters under worse constraints. Eliza set down her trowel. She straightened and the movement was deliberate, not rushed, the movement of a person transitioning from one kind of attention to another. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "That's generous." A pause, she said, "But the ground won't steal the heat. It will hold it." He looked at her the way experienced men look at young people who have said something that sounds reasonable enough to be worth engaging with, but almost certainly isn't. He was patient. He explained the physics as he understood them. The thermal mass of stone and earth was indeed real, he acknowledged, but it worked both ways. Cold ground would absorb warmth from any fire built near it as readily as it would later release that warmth, and the process of bringing that mass up to a useful temperature would require far more fuel than they had any hope of collecting before the first heavy snow. They would be pouring heat into the mountain for weeks before the mountain gave any back, and by then they would have burned through everything they had. He was not wrong. What he said was not wrong as far as it went. Eliza reached into her coat and removed the journal. She did not explain it. She did not preface it. She simply opened it to the marked page, the page with the red thread still wound around the cover, and she held it out to him. And beside it, from her other hand, she produced a piece of paper on which she had copied her father's diagram, in her own hand larger and annotated with the measurements she had already taken. Mercer looked at both. He looked at the journal page first, the original taking in the handwriting, and the sketch and the figures beside the channel. He looked at her copy, the measurements, the way she had adapted the original design to the actual dimensions of this particular cave in this particular slope. He looked at the figure for thermal conduction along the flue length. He looked at the estimated temperature differential between fireboss and stack that would create the draw. The frown deepened. He turned the journal page toward the light. He looked at the author's calculations again. "This is engineering," Eliza said quietly. "It is not theory. It is what the rock will do when you ask it correctly." Mercer was silent for a long moment. He was a man who had built his life on structural integrity, on the principle that a thing built correctly according to understood principles would stand, and a thing built wrong would not. He could not fault the underlying physics. He had no framework to fault them. The thermal mass was real. The conductive transfer was real. The mathematics of the draw were sound. What he could not accept, and this was not a matter of physics, but a matter of experience, was that a 17-year-old girl in 6 weeks with no equipment and limited materials could execute a system this precise. The execution, he said, finally will not match the theory. The joints will leak. The draw will be inconsistent. The firebox will crack under repeated heating and cooling. She looked at him without defensiveness, without anger, without the emotion he was perhaps expecting. She said, "I know every place it might fail. I have been studying my father's notes for 6 days. Those are the same problems he identified. He also wrote the solutions." Mercer handed the journal back. He stood for another long moment, looking at the trench, at the cave, at this girl standing in the autumn sunlight, with cracked hands and a certainty in her eyes that was not the certainty of arrogance, but something older and quieter than that. He shook his head, not with anger, with something more complicated than anger. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. She did not answer. She picked up her trowel and went back to work. Mercer rode back down the slope toward Coldwater Gulch. He rode slowly. He had come up the slope, a man with an answer. He was descending, a man with a question he could not quite articulate, which is often the most uncomfortable position a confident person can find themselves in. That evening in the dining room of the hotel on Main Street, where Virgil Cutter held his unofficial office hours, Mercer described what he had seen. Cutter listened with a stillness that Mercer, who was not a particularly perceptive reader of other men, took for indifference. It was not indifference. Cutter asked several questions about the condition of the cave structure, about the depth and scope of the excavation, about whether in Mercer's professional judgment, the space could be certified as structurally unsound, uninhabitable, dangerous to occupants. Mercer was an honest man. He said he had not done a formal inspection. He said on the basis of what he had seen, the cave appeared structurally sound, that it was Precambrian granite of considerable age and stability, that there was no evidence of loose ceiling rock or problematic water intrusion. Cutter said, "But you couldn't certify it as safe for winter habitation. Not without a proper inspection. Not officially." Mercer thought about this. He said, "No, I suppose I couldn't certify that." Cutter said, "Given your expertise, given what you saw, given that a woman in poor health and a minor are planning to spend the winter there, a man in your position might have a professional obligation to document his concerns." Mercer heard the words that were being spoken. He also, on some level, heard what was underneath them, though he chose not to examine that too carefully. He was a man who believed in proper procedure. He believed that structures should be certified by qualified professionals. He believed that his judgment, accumulated over 20 years of building, carried genuine weight. He said he would write up what he had seen. He said it as a man saying a reasonable thing. He did not say it as a man participating in anything. He would not have understood at that moment that both things could be true simultaneously, that something can be reasonable and wrong at the same time, that a man can act in complete good faith and still be used as a weapon. 3 days later, he rode back up the slope with a folded document. The document was written on his official letterhead. It cited structural concerns. It cited inadequate ventilation. It cited the absence of any recognized heating system and the inherent dangers of an uninsulated stone chamber during a Montana winter. It concluded in the careful language of professional assessment that the space was not suitable for winter habitation. Eliza read it standing in the cold outside the cave, the wind lifting the edges of the paper. She read it through once quickly, then again slowly. Then she did something Mercer had not anticipated. She said, "Come inside for a moment." He followed her in, ducking through the entrance, stepping into the cave's stillness. The front wall was half built. By now, the barnwood planks fitted into a frame that would eventually seal the entrance entirely, leaving only a door and a single small window. The floor had been cleared and leveled. The trench was sealed and buried its entire length, packed over with earth and flat stone, invisible now unless you knew to look for it. At the far end of the cave, the firebox sat in its finished form, a compact structure of stone and clay, with a heavy slate top, precise and functional. Mercer looked at it. He looked at all of it. Eliza placed his document on the firebox surface. She opened the journal to the marked page. She placed it beside the document. Two pieces of paper in the gray light of the cave's interior, the one formal and official, and signing the other filled with a dead man's handwriting and a diagram so precise that it could have been lifted from an engineering textbook. She pointed to the flue diagram. She explained briefly and without embellishment the path of the hot gases, the conduction, the thermal battery, the reason the smoke would be drawn down and not up, the reason the stack 40 feet away and 3 feet high would produce a thin wisp of near-clean exhaust, while the firebox inside burned hot and complete. She pointed to specific figures in her father's notes and then to corresponding measurements she had made of the actual installed system. She showed him the tolerances she had maintained. She showed him the clay seal on every joint in the flue channel. She showed him the controlled air intake on the firebox. Mercer stood and looked and listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The cave's stillness held them both. He looked at the firebox. He looked at the journal. He looked at her. His report sat on the slate surface between them. He picked it up. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. He said, "I'll think about what I've seen." He walked out of the cave into the afternoon light and rode back down the slope without another word. Eliza watched him go. She did not know what he would do with the report. She did not know whether it would disappear into his pocket or whether it would find its way to Virgil Cutter's desk, or whether the man was honest enough to let the evidence of what he had seen override the conclusions he had already written down. She did not know whether he was capable of that. She knew one thing: the flue was sealed. The firebox was built. The front wall needed 3 more days of work. The wood she and her mother had carried on their backs from the collapsed barn 2 valleys over was stacked inside the cave, enough for the first weeks if the system performed as designed. The mountain was there. The physics were what they were. The stone would either hold the heat or it would not, and no report written on official letterhead could change what the rock was going to do. She went back to work. The front wall needed 3 more days. She had 3 more days. Part 2, The Miser in the Stone. The front wall took 4 days, not 3. On the last day of Sunday, the sky came down low and gray, and the temperature dropped 12 degrees between morning and afternoon. The first real warning, not the cold itself yet, but the cold's announcement, the way a storm sends its pressure ahead of itself like a herald. Eliza worked through it. She fitted the final planks, driving the cut nails with the flat economic strokes her father had taught her, angling each one slightly so the wood would grip and not split. She packed the gaps with dried moss and straw and clay, working her fingers into every seam, every joint, every place where the outside world might find a way in. When she stepped back and looked at what she had made, it was not beautiful. The barn wood was weathered to a silver gray, the planks mismatched in width and stained with 40 years of weather from their previous life. The door was low and the window was small, its single pane of glass set in a frame she had built from the straightest piece of lumber she could find. The whole structure sat slightly crooked in the cave mouth, following the irregular line of the rock rather than the demands of a plumb line. But it was tight, every gap sealed, every joint mortared. The door swung on its leather hinges and latched against its frame with a solidity that had nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with function. She pushed at it with both hands. It did not move. She pressed her palm flat against the planks and felt no air. It would hold. Her mother appeared behind her, having walked the 2 miles on her own, with the quiet stubbornness that Ruth Stone kept in reserve for the moments when Eliza tried to manage her. She stood beside her daughter and looked at the wall in the cave mouth. Her breath made small white clouds in the darkening air. After a moment, she said, "Your father would have built it better." Eliza said he would have. Ruth said, but he would have been proud of it. They moved in the next morning. There was not much to move. 2 bedrolls, a crate of potatoes and dried beans, a small iron pot and a skillet, Owen's journal, a few books, the things that remained of a life after the expensive parts had been sold off to pay for other things. Eliza built the first fire in the late morning. She kept it small, a double handful of dry juniper branches, a few sticks of pine. She touched the flame to the tinder and watched. The smoke rose from the burning wood, and then, as she had designed as the physics required, did something that would have appeared to any observer as slightly wrong. Instead of lifting, it was drawn downwards, sucked toward the opening of the flue channel at the base of the firebox with a deep, resonant pull. The sound it made was satisfying in a way she had not fully anticipated, a low, decisive exhalation, the sound of a system doing exactly what it was built to do. The smoke disappeared into the earth. Ruth was watching from her bedroll shawl around her shoulders, hands wrapped around a cup of water, heated on the firebox top. She said nothing, but she watched the smoke vanish into the floor with an expression that moved through surprise and into something quieter and more complicated. Eliza put her palm on the stone floor 6 inches from the firebox. Cold. Completely, deeply cold. She had expected this. Her father had written it clearly. The stone is a miser. It takes a long time to fill its pockets. She pulled her hand back. She fed more wood into the firebox, measured and deliberate, not wasteful. She adjusted the air intake stone until the combustion was hot and nearly smokeless. She stood up and looked at the buried line of the flue channel, invisible now, under the packed earth and flat capstones, running its 40 feet toward the distant stack outside. Everything was in the rock's hands now. Everything was physics. She had done what could be done. But sitting with that knowledge in a cold cave in the last days of October, with the wind pressing at the sealed wall and her mother's cough breaking the silence at irregular intervals, the knowledge was not warm, not yet. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was hard and simple and surprisingly absorbing. Ruth handled the cooking and the mending. Eliza managed the fire and the ongoing maintenance of the system, checking the flue joints for any sign of cracking, monitoring the draw, adjusting the firewood to maintain a consistent combustion temperature. She kept records in a small notebook of her own, noting the ambient cave temperature each morning and evening, the outside temperature estimated from her knowledge of the conditions and the feel of the floor at 3 points along the length of the flue. The floor was the measure of everything: cold, cold, neutral, slightly less cold, something that might, if she was being generous, be called the absence of cold rather than the presence of warmth. It was on the sixth day that she first felt what she could genuinely call heat. She was lying on her bedroll in the late evening, the fire banked to coals, the cave dark except for the faint orange glow from the firebox intake. She had her hand pressed flat against the floor as she had developed the habit of doing before sleep. And the stone beneath her palm was warm. Not dramatically, not comfortably, but unambiguously warm in the way that a living thing is warm, a warmth that came from somewhere inside the mass rather than from its surface. She lay there for a long time and did not move. She thought about her father underground, 30 feet below the surface in the dark, with only his lamp and his tools and his understanding of the rock. She thought about the years of journals, the careful diagrams, the page marked with red thread. She thought about a man who knew he was living in a place and time that could kill him at any moment, who spent his evenings writing down everything he had learned so that it would exist beyond him. Don't mistake patience for failure. The miser had begun to open its pockets. It was 2 days after this, at the beginning of November, that Clem Mercer appeared. He came up the slope on a Tuesday afternoon after the school in the gulch had let out, and he came without his father's knowledge, which was evident in the way he approached the cave mouth. Cautious, alert to the sounds of the slope below in case he needed to leave quickly. He was 14 years old, slight and dark-eyed, with his father's broad forehead and something in his gaze that was entirely his own, a quick, hungry intelligence that had not yet found its proper object. He stood at the entrance and looked at the wooden wall with its mismatched planks and its careful mortar and its single glass-pane window. He looked at the thin wisp of vapor rising from the distant stone stack 40 feet away. He looked at the absence of a conventional chimney above the cave mouth. He knocked. Eliza opened the door. The warmth that slipped past her into the cold air was not dramatic, but it was real, and Clem felt it on his face like a hand placed briefly against his cheek. He said, "My father says you will be dead by Christmas." Eliza considered this. She said, "Come in and tell me what you think." He came in. He stood in the center of the cave and turned slowly, taking in the firebox, the sealed floor, the modest stack of firewood against the far wall, Ruth sitting at the small table with her, mending the 2 bedrolls with their single blanket each. He looked at the firebox for a long time, at the intake, at the absence of any upward chimney, at the way the structure sat low and compact and nothing like the fireplaces his father built. He crouched and put his hand on the floor. He held it there. He looked up at Eliza. He said, "The floor is warm." She said, "Yes." He said, "How?" She showed him the journal. She showed him the diagram, the copy she had made with her own annotations. She walked him through the logic of it, the flue path, the conduction, the thermal battery, the reason the draw worked by temperature differential rather than height. She used plain language because he was 14, but she did not simplify the physics because he did not need her to. He asked questions. Good questions. Questions that went to the places where the system was most complicated and where the failure modes were most likely. He had his father's structural instinct, the habit of looking for where a thing might break, but without his father's certainty that he already knew the answer. He came back the next day, and the day after that, he started bringing things. A flat stone of a particularly useful shape he had found near the creek. A piece of iron banding from a broken barrel that Eliza could use as a damper improvement. He helped her adjust the air intake geometry on the firebox, the two of them working in the confined space of the cave's interior, speaking little, communicating largely through the shorthand of people who are both looking at the same problem from the same angle. Ruth watched this with the careful attention of a woman who had raised a solitary child and recognized what she was seeing. She said nothing. She made an extra cup of tea without being asked when the boy arrived each afternoon, and she set it on the table without ceremony, and that was all. On the sixth day of this arrangement, the afternoon of November 9th, Aldous Mercer came up the slope. He came faster than usual, the gray horse moving at a trot that slowed to a walk only when the ground got steep. He dismounted at the cave mouth without tying the horse and went through the door without knocking. Clem was on his knees beside the firebox, fitting the iron banding into a new intake configuration, while Eliza held the piece in place from the other side. They both looked up. The expression on Aldous Mercer's face was not the thoughtful frown of his first visit. It was harder than that. It was the expression of a man who had been made to feel foolish in a way he hadn't anticipated and was processing that feeling as anger because anger was more manageable than embarrassment. He said his son's name in a single flat syllable. Clem stood. Something happened in his face, a brief, complicated negotiation between the person he was with Eliza and the person he was required to be in front of his father. Aldous said, I told you to stay away from this place. Clem said I was just helping with the Aldous crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took the boy by the arm with the grip of a man who builds things for a living and has never learned to moderate the strength in his hands for the scale of the task. He pulled Clem toward the door. He stopped at the threshold and turned back. He looked at the firebox. He looked at the floor. He looked at Eliza, who had not moved, who was still holding the piece of iron banding in her hands, watching him with that particular stillness of hers. He said, no son of mine will waste his time on a dead girl's foolishness. The words sat in the cave's air. Ruth Stone set down her mending. She stood up from the table with the slowness of a woman whose body required some negotiation before it would do what she asked of it. She walked to where Aldous Mercer stood in the doorway of the cave that her daughter had built out of inherited knowledge and weeks of labor and faith in a dead man's handwriting. She stopped in front of him. She said quietly, with no performance in it at all, his father would have listened. Nothing more than that. No accusation, no anger. Just 7 words in a soft voice spoken plainly into the face of a man who knew, even as he heard them, that they were true. Aldous Mercer's jaw tightened. He looked at Ruth for a moment with an expression that could not settle into anything comfortable. Then he walked out with his son. Eliza listened to the horse's hooves on the slope diminishing until the only sounds were the wind outside and the low, steady pull of the flue drawing heat down into the earth. She looked at the iron banding in her hands. She set it down on the firebox surface. She went back to work. The day shortened. The cold gathered itself with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. November moved toward its end. The temperature inside the cave rose in slow increments, a degree. Here a degree there, the great thermal battery of the mountain floor charging with all the unhurried certainty of geology. By the middle of the month, the floor along the full length of the flue was consistently warm to the touch. Not hot, but the steady, even warmth of a body at rest radiating up through the stone and earth with a constancy that no fireplace in Coldwater Gulch could match. Ruth's cough began almost imperceptibly to ease. It did not vanish, but it lost its sharp edge, the quality that had made it sound like something tearing. The stable warmth, the absence of the temperature cycling that plagued conventional heated spaces, the clean air that the efficient combustion produced, all of it was doing what Eliza had believed it would do, what her father's notes had suggested it would do slowly and without drama, the way genuine healing tends to work. Ruth slept longer. She moved with less effort. She sat at the table in the evenings without her shawl, which had been a constant companion for 2 years, and she read or mended or simply looked at the warm stone walls with an expression that was private and not for sharing, but that Eliza caught sometimes in the corner of her vision and held there quietly. The town, for its part, had made up its mind. News of the bizarre excavation and the wooden wall and the smoke that went down instead of up had moved through Coldwater Gulch with the speed that small communities reserve for information that confirms what they already believe. What the town believed was that the stone women were either dangerously misguided or in some whispered quarters touched in the way that grief sometimes touches people made strange and unreachable by loss. Several men made the ride out on various pretexts during the weeks of November. Trapline checks, boundary surveys. They arrived, looked at the stone stack 40 feet from the silled cave mouth, with its thin, near-invisible exhaust, and they left with their assessments intact. The thing didn't look right. A proper chimney went up. Every chimney in every house and cabin from here to the Pacific went up. This one went sideways and then underground and then up 40 feet away from the fire itself. It was not how things were done. Virgil Cutter, for his part, had heard from Mercer that the structural report had not been filed. That Mercer had, after his second visit to the cave, experienced some professional ambivalence about its conclusions. Cutter had expressed his views on this ambivalence in terms that left Mercer in no doubt about what was expected. But Mercer was underneath his stubbornness, a man who signed his name to things he could defend, and he had found in the quiet of several evenings reviewing his own notes that he could not entirely defend this one. The report sat in his desk drawer. Unsigned. Cutter let it sit. He had other instruments. He had patience. He had winter, which was coming, regardless of any legal document, and which would accomplish what the report had been intended to accomplish, only more thoroughly and without his name attached to it. He told himself this and found it sufficient. The last week of November, Eliza and her mother had their first genuinely warm evening. Not warm in the relative sense that had sustained them for the previous weeks, the absence of cold, the neutrality of the air. Warm in the absolute sense, the sense that required no comparison. They sat at the table without coats or shawls. The candles on the table burned without the slight waver that moving air produces. The floor beneath their feet was steady, and even in its heat, the whole 40-foot length of the flue running its quiet thermal work below the packed earth, the mountain's vast patience finally beginning to express itself as the kind of warmth that a person could live inside. Eliza held her palm flat against the floor for what felt like a long time. She thought of the first night 2 weeks earlier when she had sat in the same place with her hand against the same stone and felt nothing at all. She thought of the cold that had seemed absolute, then fundamental, the cold of a mountain that had been accumulating its temperature through millennia and was not going to be changed in a day by a girl with a pickaxe and a dead man's notebook. She had been afraid that night. She had not let it show. Not to her mother, not to anyone, but she had been afraid with a specific and particular fear. Not the fear of dying, though that was present too, but the fear of having been wrong about her father. The fear that the faith she had placed in his pages was not engineering, but grief, not physics, but the longing of a daughter for a man who was not there anymore. Don't mistake patience for failure. She took her hand off the floor. She looked across the table at her mother, who was reading by candlelight with her shawl folded unused on the chair beside her, her breathing even and quiet in the warm, still air. She said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The stone beneath their feet was speaking in its own language, the only language it had, slow and constant and utterly reliable, and both of them could hear it perfectly well. December came. The cold outside became serious. The kind of cold that tests the integrity of every structure in the valley, that finds the gaps in every wall, the weaknesses in every chimney, the limitations of every cord of firewood. In Coldwater Gulch, families who had thought themselves well prepared for winter began to revise that assessment. Wood burned faster than anticipated. Drafts appeared in walls that had been called tight. The great stone fireplaces that Aldous Mercer had built with his skilled hands and his proven techniques consumed fuel at a rate that made the men who owned them do quiet mathematics about what remained stacked in their yards. In the cave at the eastern boundary, Eliza fed the firebox 3 times a day with careful, measured loads of wood. Each load was small, a few pieces at a time, enough to maintain the combustion temperature without overwhelming the system's capacity. The floor held its warmth between firings like a stone holds the sun after the sun has gone down. A day's worth of firewood in the cave would have kept a conventional cabin comfortable for perhaps 3 hours. She began to write in her own notebook with more detail. Temperature observations, fuel consumption, floor temperature at multiple points, outside conditions. She was building a record not because she knew what she would do with it, but because her father had taught her that careful observation was never wasted, that the data you collect before you need it is the only data that exists at the moment you need it. She also began in the evenings to write something else, not observations, not figures, a description of the system in plain language from beginning to end, as if she were explaining it to someone who had never heard of a thermal mass hearth or a buried flue. She wrote it plainly, step by step, the way her father had written in his journal, precise and unhurried, nothing assumed, everything stated. She did not know why she was writing it. She only knew that the knowledge existed, and that knowledge which existed only in one place was fragile, and that her father had understood this better than most. Outside December moved toward its end. The high peaks disappeared behind cloud that did not lift for days at a time. The creek froze from its edges inward. The sound of the wind at night had taken on a new quality, lower and more continuous. The sound of something that was not a temporary condition, but a permanent state of affairs. The sound of a Montana winter that had finally arrived at full strength and intended to stay. In the cave, the candles burned straight and still. The floor was warm. Part 3. Be the Mountain, January 12, 1888. The morning began without warning. That was the thing people would say afterward in the months and years when Coldwater Gulch tried to make sense of what had happened. They would say it came without warning, though what they meant was that the warning came too fast to act on. The sky at noon was pale blue and cold, but not threatening. Children were released from the schoolhouse at 2:30. Men were working their claims, riding their fence lines, going about the ordinary business of a winter afternoon in a mining settlement that believed itself prepared for whatever the season had left to offer. The temperature at 3 o'clock was 12 degrees below freezing. By 4, it was 30 below. The wind arrived between those 2 hours like something that had been held back by force and then released all at once. It came from the northwest, which was the direction all bad weather in that valley came from, but at a speed that had no precedent in any living memory. It did not build. It arrived at full strength, a continuous physical force that was not weather in the ordinary sense, but something closer to an alteration of the atmosphere itself, a rearrangement of the world's air pressure that happened to intersect with this particular valley in this particular way on this particular afternoon. The snow came with the wind, not falling snow, but driven snow, horizontal and fine as ground glass, a solid white curtain that erased distance and direction and the difference between sky and ground. Within 20 minutes of the wind's arrival, a man standing at his own front door could see the building across the street. Within an hour, the world as Coldwater Gulch had known it ceased to exist. In the cave at the eastern boundary, Eliza was reading. She had been reading for most of the afternoon, sitting at the small table with a candle and one of the 3 books. They owned her feet flat on the warm floor. Her coat hung on the peg beside the door. The wind reached her as sound first, a low building note that rose quickly to something she had no word for, a continuous roar that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously, as if the mountain itself were speaking at full volume for the first time. She went to the window and looked out. White, nothing but white moving sideways with a violence that was almost mechanical, like something manufactured rather than natural. The stone stack 40 feet away was invisible. The slope below was invisible. The world had been reduced to the wooden wall in front of her and the white chaos beyond it. She checked the firebox. She added wood a little more than usual and adjusted the intake for slightly higher combustion. She checked the door latch, the window frame, the mortar along the base of the wall where it met the rock. Everything held. She pressed her palm to the wall planks and felt no air moving through them. Then she sat back down and listened to the storm try to find a way in. It could not. The tons of granite that surrounded them on three sides and above were impervious to wind in a way that no timber structure could ever be. The sealed wooden wall absorbed the pressure and held. The temperature inside the cave did not drop. The floor continued its steady radiation. The candle on the table burned without moving. Ruth slept. Her breathing was even, her face relaxed in the candlelight, her shawl folded beside her. The cough that had been the constant accompaniment of their lives for 2 years was in this warm, still air almost entirely absent. Eliza watched her mother sleep for a moment with the particular attention of someone who has spent a long time watching another person struggle and is still adjusting to the sight of them at rest. She went back to her book. The storm raged for 3 days. In Coldwater Gulch, the cost began to accumulate immediately. The temperature did not rise above -20 for the duration. Firewood that families had believed adequate proved catastrophically insufficient. The great open fireplaces that dominated the main rooms of the town's better homes, the ones that Aldous Mercer had built with his skilled hands and his mastery of proportion and draw, became insatiable. They consumed cord after cord, and the rooms around them remained brutally cold, a mere 10 feet from the flames. The convective engine of a large fireplace demands a continuous supply of replacement air, and that air must be drawn from somewhere. And in a storm of this magnitude, it was drawn through every gap and crack and joint in every wall, a constant river of Arctic air feeding the fire while the fire's heat rushed upward into the Montana sky. The wood ran out in stages. First the families who had prepared least, then the families who had prepared adequately for a normal winter. By the morning of the second day, even the households that had been considered well-provisioned were doing arithmetic that didn't resolve into survival. Furniture burned. Fence posts were pulled up and split. A man on the south end of town burned his barn doors. A family near the assay office burned their floorboards. The livestock in the barns died first from cold, and then from the absence of any human warmth to share, and the sound of that dying was added to the general register of the storm. The schoolhouse was opened as a communal shelter. Families crowded in, sharing what remained of their wood-sharing blankets, sharing the company of other desperate people, in the way that desperate people do, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Children cried. Old men sat with their eyes closed and their hands folded with the stillness of people conserving every calorie of warmth they still possessed. In his home on the north side of Main Street, Aldous Mercer burned his last log at midnight on the second day. The house went cold within 2 hours. It went genuinely cold, not the relative cold of an underheated room, but the cold of the outside world occupying interior space. The kind of cold that makes a person understand viscerally in the animal core of them that their body is a small and temporary thing surrounded by an enormous, indifferent force. His youngest Clem had been feverish for 2 days. The fever had come on the afternoon the storm arrived, the way fevers sometimes do in children, abruptly and without obvious cause. Under normal circumstances, it would have been concerning. In a house that was now functionally the same temperature as the air outside, it was something else. Clem lay on his bedroll under every blanket in the house, his breathing shallow and rapid, his face the particular gray-white color of a child whose body is losing a contest it cannot afford to lose. Aldous Mercer had done everything a man could do. He had burned everything burnable. He had piled every blanket onto his son. He had held the boy through the night with his own body as a source of warmth that was itself diminishing. By the gray, featureless light of the storm's third morning, with the temperature inside his house, at the same brutal -20 that existed outside its walls, he understood that he had run out of options. There was one option left. It was not technically an option he would have chosen under any other circumstances in any world where his choices were still governed by pride and professional certainty in the habit of being right. But Clem's breath was coming in short, shallow increments that had a sound in them he could not name and did not want to name, and the arithmetic of fatherhood is very simple, and it has only one answer. He dressed in every layer he owned. He went out into the storm. The world outside was a white erasure. He could not see 10 feet. He navigated by feel, by his knowledge of the land, by the memory of a path he had ridden twice in better weather, and was now walking by instinct in conditions that wanted him to stop. The snow was waist-deep in the drifts and knee-deep everywhere else. His lungs burned with each breath, the air too cold to be taken in directly, and he learned quickly to breathe through the wool of his scarf and take what oxygen he could from the small, warmed pocket that created. He walked the 2 miles in something between 40 minutes and forever. The slope up to the cave was the worst of it, the drifts unpredictable, the footing treacherous beneath the smooth surface of the wind-packed snow. He fell twice. The second time he lay in the snow for a moment longer than the first, and the moment had a quality of stillness that frightened him the way a long pause in a conversation frightens you when the other person is known to have something difficult to say. He thought about Clem's face. He got up. He saw the light before he saw anything else. A faint, warm yellow glow in the single small window of the wooden wall, visible only because he was close enough now to see it through the driving snow. Then the wall itself, the mismatched planks and their careful mortar sitting solid and untouched in the rock face, while the storm did everything the storm was capable of doing. No drift had built against it. The rock shoulder above and to the left had kept it clear, just as the mountain's geometry had always dictated, just as Owen Stone had noted in his survey of 1883. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the enormous white silence. The door opened. The warmth hit him first, not the scorching blast of a fireplace, nothing so aggressive. A deep, even radiant warmth that seemed to come from all directions, simultaneously from the floor and the walls and the air itself, a warmth that had no source you could point to and no direction you could face away from. It was the warmth of something that had been accumulating for weeks in a thermal mass so large that it gave up its heat the way the earth gives up its heat slowly and completely and without reservation. Aldous Mercer walked through the door of the cave that he had twice told a 17-year-old girl would kill her. He stood in the center of the space. He looked at the firebox with its modest bed of coals. He looked at the sealed floor, smooth and level. He looked at Ruth Stone sitting at the table with her book and her cup of tea, wearing no shawl, needing no shawl. He looked at Eliza, who had stepped back from the door and was watching him with the same still attention she always carried, her face neither triumphant nor cold, simply present. He looked at his own hands. He pulled off his gloves. His fingers were white and stiff, the skin across his knuckles cracked from the cold. He looked at the floor. He bent down. He placed both palms flat against the stone. The warmth that came up through his hands into his body was the warmth of a thing that had been right all along, quietly and without argument, waiting for the moment when rightness and reality would align. It entered him through his palms and moved up his arms, and he knelt there on the cave floor with his hands pressed against the stone that the girl had laid, and the heat had charged, and he did not speak because there was nothing to say that the stone was not already saying more clearly than he could. He looked up at Eliza. She met his eyes. He nodded once. A slow, complete movement of the head that contained everything the situation required. The acknowledgement, the accounting, the transfer of understanding between two people who had been looking at the same thing from opposite sides and had now finally arrived at the same position. She nodded back. "My boy," he said. His voice was a thing that had been through the horns and the wind and the long walk and everything he had been required to feel during it. "My boy is sick. He has fever. We have nothing left to burn." Eliza was already moving. She went to the wood stack and took an armful enough to sustain a fire in a second location for several hours. She took the small sled that leaned against the cave wall and laid the wood on it. She went to the food crate and took half of what remained and wrapped it in cloth. She handed the sled rope to Mercer. She said, "Bring your family here. The road is the same road you walked. Stay to the right of the slope where the rock's shoulder blocks the worst of the drift. Take this wood and build a fire in your house long enough to get them warm and moving. Then bring them here." He stood with the sled rope in his hand and looked at the armful of wood on it wood from a supply that was not large to begin with. Wood that she was giving him without hesitation or calculation. Wood that represented some portion of the margin between their own survival and the alternative. He had no words for what he was feeling. He had built 20 years of professional certainty on the idea that he understood structural integrity better than anyone in this valley. He had built on top of that certainty a confidence in his own judgment that had made him useful and sometimes kind, and occasionally, without his ever quite recognizing it, cruel in the specific way that very confident people are cruel by the ease with which they dismiss what they haven't understood. He had been wrong about the cave. He had been wrong about the girl. He had said in this very space that no son of his would waste his time on a dead girl's foolishness, and the dead girl's foolishness was what was going to save his son's life. He picked up the sled rope. He walked back out into the storm. He returned 4 hours later with his wife and Clem, wrapped in blankets and carried on his father's back for the last quarter mile when his legs gave out. Eliza had the floor warm and the firebox steady and a pot of bean soup heated on the slate top. Ruth had made up 2 additional bedrolls from the spare blankets and the coats they didn't need because they didn't need them, because the floor was warm and the walls were warm and the air was warm and the mountain did not care about the storm outside any more than it had ever cared about any of the small human dramas occurring at its base. Clem was set down near the center of the floor, where the flue ran its full depth below and the thermal output was highest. Within an hour, his color had changed. Within 2 hours, he was breathing with something approaching normal depth and rhythm. He slept through the night on the warm stone floor, with his face relaxed and his fever breaking soon. Way fevers break when the body's essential conditions are restored gradually and with the quiet relief of a crisis that is passed without becoming permanent. Mercer sat against the cave wall for most of that night. He did not sleep. He watched his son breathe, and he looked at the cave around him, and he thought about whatever men think about when they are given the gift of a near miss, and the simultaneous obligation to understand exactly how close the miss had been. By the second day of refuge, a second family had arrived. The Holloways from the claim nearest the tree line who had found the cave by following Mercer's tracks in the snow tracks that were already half filled but visible if you were desperate enough to look carefully. They came in with 2 children and nothing left but the clothes they wore. Eliza made room. Ruth moved her bedroll. The food crate was recalculated and found sufficient. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the storm showed its first signs of exhaustion, as the wind dropped from its sustained roar to something merely fierce, a figure appeared at the cave door alone. Virgil Cutter was a man who had spent 30 years in this territory and had survived its conditions by a combination of material preparation and the kind of practical intelligence that expresses itself in financial rather than physical terms. He owned enough wood, enough food, enough of everything because owning enough of everything was the principle on which his life was organized. He had never in 30 years found himself in a position that his resources could not address. He stood at the door of the cave with a child in his arms, his niece, 6 years old, the daughter of his sister who had come to Coldwater Gulch the previous spring and who was herself at the schoolhouse shelter with a twisted ankle that had made the 2-mile walk to the cave impossible. The child had been brought by Cutter himself on foot through the last of the storm's worst hours, because the shelter was running out of heat, and a small child without adequate warmth goes quiet in a way that is not sleep. And Virgil Cutter, who was a man of many failures, was not prepared to be a man who let a child die while he possessed the ability to prevent it. He stood at the door and his face carried the full weight of what it had cost him to arrive there. Not the physical cost, though, that was considerable. The other cost. The cost of being a man who signs papers without reading them carefully, who uses other men's expertise as instruments of his own purposes, who looks at a girl with her father's pickaxe and her father's notebook and sees foolishness where there is engineering, who gives people land he considers worthless and calls it charity. He had no speech prepared. He had not prepared one because preparation would have required him to acknowledge in advance of the moment what the moment was going to require him to be. Eliza opened the door. She looked at him. She looked at the child. She took the child from his arms. She carried the girl to the warmest part of the floor and laid her down and covered her with a blanket and placed her palm against the child's cheek, assessing with the calm efficiency of someone who has been managing the difference between adequate and inadequate warmth for 3 months. The child was cold, but not unreachably cold. She would be fine. Cutter stood in the doorway. He did not move to enter until Ruth Stone, without looking up from the pot she was tending, said simply, "Close the door. You're letting the cold in." He came inside. He closed the door behind him. He stood in the warmth of the cave and looked at the 6 other people occupying the space that 2 women had made habitable by hand. And he looked at the child on the floor with color already beginning to return to her face. And he looked at Eliza Stone, who was 17 years old, and the daughter of a Welsh miner who had not lived to 40 and who had built out of that inheritance, and her own labor and her refusal to accept the verdict of people who were wrong a machine that was keeping his niece alive. He said nothing that night. There was nothing adequate to say, and he was intelligent enough to know it. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 4th day, the sky that appeared was the hard, indifferent blue of deep cold following violence, the sun returning not with warmth but with light, crystalline and merciless over a landscape rearranged by drifts into something almost unfamiliar. The temperature was still 20 below. The air was absolutely still. The families made their way back to town in stages. Clem Mercer walked on his own. The Holloway children rode on the sled, pulled by their father through the deep snow. Cutter carried his niece for the first mile, and then when she woke fully and demanded to be put down and allowed to walk, he walked beside her with his hand available and not insisted upon. Eliza watched them go from the cave mouth, her arms crossed against the cold, her breath making its small clouds in the morning air. Aldous Mercer was the last to leave. He stood with his horse on the slope below the cave, his wife and son already 50 yards ahead on the path, and he turned back and looked at the wooden wall and the distant stone stack and the woman standing in the entrance with her father's stillness and her mother's clarity of gaze. He said, "I would like to build it properly." She looked at him. He said, "The wall, the firebox, a second flue for expansion if you'll allow it. I have lumber. I know how to work stone better than I knew 3 months ago." He paused. "I would like to build it the way it deserves to be built." Eliza considered this for a moment. She said, "Spring, when the ground is workable." He nodded. He said, "There are other families in this valley who will need to know how it works. The Holloways, the Carmichaels on the North Claim." "There are others." She said, "I know." He said, "I have been building in this valley for 20 years. I know how to transfer a technique. I know how to teach men who build for a living. If you would be willing to explain the system to me completely, I can carry it further than either of us could alone." The offer hung in the cold morning air between them. It was not a simple offer. It was, among other things, an acknowledgement of the 20 years and what they had not contained of the report that sat unsigned in his desk drawer of a boy named Clem, who had been told not to waste his time and had wasted it anyway, and had been more right to do so than his father had been to forbid it. Eliza understood all of this. She did not require him to say it. She said, "Come in the spring." "Bring Clem." He turned and walked down the slope after his family. The reckoning with Virgil Cutter came 3 weeks later in the quiet aftermath of the storm, when the town had tallied its losses and begun the long, cold work of deciding what came next. He came to the cave alone in the afternoon, on a day when the temperature had risen enough to make the ride bearable. He did not bring money. He had thought about bringing money because money was the instrument he reached for reflexively when a situation required addressing. He had put the money away. He sat across the table from Eliza and said what he had come to say. He said that the deed stood, that the land was hers uncontested with all its clauses, that he had no further interest in any arrangement that worked against her. He said that he understood, having read his own document more carefully than he had at the time of signing, that the mineral clause existed and that it was hers. He said that he would like to propose a different kind of arrangement if she was willing to hear it. She was willing to hear it. He had resources, capital, materials. He had relationships with the timber suppliers and the stonemasons and the men who moved goods through the territory. He had, in short, the capacity to build things at a scale that a girl with her father's pickaxe and 3 months of supplies could not. What he did not have, and what he had spent the past several weeks understanding he had never had, was the knowledge of how to build them correctly. Eliza listened. She looked at her hands on the table, at the calluses in the healed cracks, in the particular roughness that comes from weeks of working with stone and clay and iron. She said, "The mineral rights stay with me." He said, "Yes." She said, "The system gets built in every home in this valley that needs it at cost, not for profit." He said, "That is not how I have operated." She looked at him. He said, "That is not how I have operated previously." She said, "Clem Mercer learns the system fully. He teaches it to whoever comes after." He said, "Mercer's boy." She said, "He understood it from the first day he saw it. He earned that." Cutter sat with this. He was a man reassembling something in himself that the storm had broken apart and that would not go back together in its original configuration. He was not certain yet what shape the new configuration would take. He only knew that the child he had carried 2 miles through the worst storm in the territory's memory had been warm within an hour of arriving in this cave, and that the woman across the table from him had built the thing that made her warm, and that he had tried in his indirect way to take it from her. He said, agreed. Spring came, the way it always comes to that country, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow retreated from the lower slopes first, and then from the middle elevations, leaving behind the saturated dark earth that carried in its surface the record of everything the winter had done to it. The creek ran high and loud. The juniper on the scree slope above the cave sent out its first tentative green. Aldous Mercer came in the last week of April, as he had said he would. He came with Clem and with 2 other men who built for a living and who had spent the winter thinking about what had happened in the storm and what it meant for how they understood their own craft. They stood in the cave, and Eliza explained the system from the beginning. She used her father's journal and her own notebook and the diagrams she had been refining through the winter months. She explained the thermal mass principle and the conductive transfer in the draw mechanics. She explained the tolerances that mattered and the ones that had room. She explained what would fail and how and what to do about it. Mercer asked questions. Good questions, the questions of a man who was learning rather than confirming, which is the rarer and more valuable kind. Clem stood at his father's shoulder and said little and understood everything. By midsummer, 3 homes in Coldwater Gulch had been retrofitted. By the following autumn, 7 more. The design was adapted for different configurations, different soil types, different orientations, each adaptation returning to the same principles, because the principles did not change with the application. You were working with the rock's nature, not against it. You were asking the mountain to hold what you gave it and to give it back slowly. You were teaching the smoke to pay for its passage. The system came to be known in the valley simply as the stone method, which was the name that arose naturally and that no one thought to dispute because it was accurate in both its meanings, describing at once the material it worked with and the family from whom it came. Owen Stone's journal remained in the cave at the eastern boundary on the small table where Eliza had first read it by candlelight on the night the world handed her a death sentence written on a deed. She did not keep it locked away. She did not treat it as a relic. It was a working document available to anyone who came to learn, opened always to the marked page. The red thread still wound around the cover, the diagram visible to whoever sat down at the table. The last line of that page, the one Owen Stone had written in letters slightly larger than his usual careful script, on an autumn afternoon in 1883, sitting in a cold cave he had found while looking for something else in a country far from the valleys where he had been born, writing for a reader he could not have named at the time, but must on some level have imagined. The tree fights the wind and breaks. The mountain does not fight the cold. It absorbs it and remembers. Be the mountain. Ruth Stone lived 11 more years. Her cough did not return in any serious form after the winter of 1887. She died in the spring of 1899, in the cave that had become over the years something considerably more than a cave, a set of connected rooms, a garden on the terrace below a home, in the fullest sense of the word. She died warm. Eliza Stone lived into the new century and past it. She never left the gulch. She never stopped working. She became in the way that people who know essential things become the person that others came to when the essential questions needed answering. Not a figurehead, not a monument, a working person, competent and precise and possessed of the particular quietness that belongs to those who have learned to listen to the deep language of the earth and have found it sufficient. She kept her father's journal. She kept it on the table. She kept it open.